while since I have got on here and made a video, but I'm wanting to get started. I kind of took a break during the summer, but I'm wanting to get started back. And so the first video that I wanted to do coming back was my favorite reads of the summer. Now, this is going to go all the way from June to into August, because I want to say there's probably something that has made its way in from this month's reading so far. So I just want to talk about my favorite reads of the summer. And this won't be everything I read. I read a good bit more than this, but this is just going to kind of be the highlight of my favorite reads of the summer. I'm going to start off with Stone and Ruin by Z.S. Diamante. Now, this is the last book of his series, Stone and Sky series. It's a trilogy. In fact, I read 2 of these books during the summer, and both of them I loved. I just showed this one just because it was probably my favorite of the series. In fact, I kind of said that the second one was my favorite of the series, and it's one of those things where it's kind of a toss-up. Both of them were great. Both of them were exciting. A classic fantasy feel. If you like, just like I said, the classic fantasy feel, that's something that is clean, something that of course, there's violence and there's some higher stakes. They're trying to save the world, but it still has more of a clean atmosphere. There's not sex, there's violence, but not gruesome violence. This is a wonderful series. I hope you'll check it out. Again, this is one of my favorite reads of the summer. Moving on next, something quite different is Boys in the Valley. Boys in the Valley is a book that I hadn't heard of until I heard Mike from Mike's Book Reads talk about it. And I'm always looking for a horror book to add to my reading list. I didn't read any horror up till about a couple of years ago, maybe. And I wanted to start adding some horror. I've read a lot of Stephen King, and I heard him talking about this, so I picked this up. Philip Fracassi, probably butchering that name, Boys in the Valley. This is a possession story meets a creepy children's story. If you've read Children of the Corn, if you've watched movies or read other books like that, that's really what this entails. It's all fit in this. And a lot of the horror books I've read lately have been good, but haven't really spooked me, I guess you'd say. And I was looking for something that would kind of just make me uncomfortable and maybe just freak me out a little bit. And I think this did it. It takes place in an orphanage, a Catholic orphanage, and so priests run it, and there's some dealings with that and how that works, and religious upbringings, and all of that. I don't think it's not, a lot of your religious horror completely goes against religion in every way. This doesn't seem to do that. Has both good and bad, I would say, but a very good horror book this summer that I've read. I'm going to show 2 books. These 2 books, this is Dead Man's Walk by Larry McMurtry, and also Comanche Moon by Larry McMurtry. So last year, in fact, it was my book of the year, I read Lonesome Dove, and that is really the first book in this series. Then there's a second book in the series, which is Streets of Laredo, which I also read this summer, which didn't make this video, if that tells you anything. I felt like Streets of Laredo was a lot more dark than I wanted. Of course, Lonesome Dove was dark. If you've read Lonesome Dove, be prepared for all the content warnings. A lot of death, a lot of violence, a lot of grim dark. I know usually we call fantasy grim dark, but a lot of grim dark. And these had that as well. Streets of Laredo went a little further than I wanted to go. These gave me the same feelings of Lonesome Dove. And very violent, very rough, cowboy shooting, all of that really follows specific Comanche tribes throughout the books that you see coming again, talked about in Lonesome Dove. But these would be prequels to Lonesome Dove. Both of these would be prequels to Lonesome Dove. And I thoroughly enjoyed this, to where they are some of my favorite reads of the summer. And depending on how the rest of the year goes, one might make one of my favorite books of the year. So if you've read Lonesome Dove, if you haven't read Lonesome Dove, please read Lonesome Dove. If you have read Lonesome Dove and kind of wonder if you want to read the other books, I would say read it. You may read Comanche, or you may read Streets of Laredo and just absolutely love it. didn't really work for me, all in all. There was a lot of good about it, but there was also a lot of, it was very heavy. But I would especially encourage you to read these. Very highly recommended. Next up, I have been continuing in the Stormlight Archive, and this is Words of Radiance. I'm reading Oathbringer right now. In fact, I'm not halfway through it. I'm about 500 pages through it. In fact, I'm a little over 500 pages, and that's not halfway, because it's a chunker of a book. But this is, and I've heard other people say this is one of the best fantasy books I've ever read, period. Exciting from one end to the other. There are some slow burn moments, but there's also a lot of speed in it. Brandon Sanderson, I have talked about on videos and on other social media platforms that some of Brandon Sanderson hasn't worked for me. I read the first Mistborn book and it was okay. Then I read the second one and I DNF'd it. I've read some of the other Brandon Sanderson books, earlier books on the Cosmere, and they were okay. I didn't not like them, but they didn't make me think, well, I'm just going to be the biggest Brandon Sanderson fan ever. And people told me, you need to read Stormlight Archive. And so I read The Way of Kings. And I think I made a video on this earlier in the year. It blew me away. It's great fantasy. And this stepped up so much more than even The Way of Kings. Fantastic fantasy. Fantastic character work. In fact, that's one of my problems that I had with the other books that I read by Brandon Sanderson. I felt like I wasn't connecting with the characters very well. I'm very much character driven. Great world building. I just didn't feel like I was connecting with the characters. I read Elantris, I read Warbreaker, and then I had read The Final Empire. And I just didn't feel like I was connecting well with his characters. It's not the case in these books. Even up to now where I'm nearly halfway through Oathbringer, I love these characters. Some of the best characters of fantasy I've ever read. Kaladin Stormblessed is just a fantastic character. And then, of course, continuing on to read, I've grown to really, and I'm thankful for the book that I'm reading right now, Oathbringer, is kind of focusing on a certain character's backstory, and I really am enjoying that. So, another one of my favorite reads of the summer. Highly recommend. These next two, I read these both during the summer months, and that is Ruin by John Gwynne, and also the concluding book of The Faithful and the Fallen, which is Wrath. I knew I was going to love this series. Other people told me when I was talking about some series that I loved, some things I love to read, some types of storytelling I love to read. I think Philip Chase told me, and others told me, if you haven't read The Faithful and the Fallen, you need to read The Faithful and the Fallen because I think you'd really like it. And I absolutely did. This, of course, there are some darker moments, and I have found that very dark fantasy may not be the best pick for me always. There are some darker moments in these, but again, I would say classic fantasy. I'm not comparing it directly to Tolkien, but I would say it's in the vein of that. A very hopeful fantasy. A lot of bad things happens to these characters. A lot of emotional moments. You feel ruined sometimes. You feel like wrath is falling down on you sometimes. And you worry about the characters. But just the overwhelming feeling of hope that comes along with these wonderful stories. I love this series. This is going to become one of my favorite series I've ever read. I just have to figure out where on that list it's going to fall. So The Faithful and the Fallen. Those two books, I loved all the books. The first one was a little harder to get into, Malice. And then you had, and I'm forgetting the name of the second book, but I enjoyed it more than the first book. And then when Ruin hit, it was like everything stepped up. And then Wrath was a great conclusion. So I loved that series. I also read Dune Messiah. I read the first book of Dune, I believe in January of this year. And I know Dune is one of those you take it or you leave it. You love it or you hate it. And I loved it. I could definitely see why it's a classic of science fiction, sci-fantasy, whatever you want to call it. But it was a wonderful book. And then I didn't know if I wanted to continue because people tell me the further you read, the weirder the books get. And then some of my friends said, well, you need to at least read the first three or at least read Dune Messiah and decide if you want to move on from there. Well, I read Dune Messiah and a lot shorter than Dune itself, but still a story that pulls you in. I don't hear a lot of people talk about the character work, but I feel like the character work in these are amazing. Just, you feel one way about the main character, and then you begin to see him making decisions that you kind of understand why they're making the decisions, and maybe society around him is making him make these decisions, but still, should he do the thing? Should he do that? And you hope he doesn't, but you hope he, anyway, and it just, you go back and forth. And then after I read this, the first book and this book, I realized, man, I really like these characters. And so, fantastic read. If you haven't started the Dune books, I would say it may be a good idea to do it. If you read Dune 1 and you say, this is not for me, maybe stop there. But I would encourage you to at least try it if you like sci-fi, sci-fantasy. And then the last book on this. These books haven't been in order. Not in order by the months I read them. Not in order by least favorite to favorite. These are just all my favorite reads of the summer. My most favorite read of the summer. I thought it was going to be hard to pass Wrath. And I will forever love that book, Wrath. You keep hearing my chair click. But I think this did it. I think this passed it. So I think when January, February, I decided that I was, probably January, I decided that I was going to read through the works of John Gwynne. Most of it. I was going to read through The Faithful and the Fallen. I'm going to read through the Bloodsworn saga in preparation for the latest book coming out in October. And I'm almost there. I've got one more book to read before I'm ready. Of course, then there's that other series that came from the Banished Lands that I want to read. I'm going to get to, absolutely. But anyway, Shadow of the Gods. It didn't take any time for me to completely fall into this story. It didn't take any time for me to be whisked away in a fantasy land and completely only concerned about what's going on in this book. It just went while I was reading it. It was just, it was fantastic. Probably one of my first Norse-inspired, Viking-inspired fantasy. Made me want to read more things like that. John Gwynne is an amazing writer, and so far, every book he's written has gotten better than the last. Absolutely every book he's written has got better than the last, and I can't wait to see what's coming next. This is the book, of course, with the dragon on it. The next book, I believe, has a wolf, and I wish I would have looked at it before I came in here because I can't remember the name of it right now. Maybe it's The Curse of the Gods. But anyway, I look forward to reading it. I look forward to continuing on in this story. And I know that I already said that's going to become one of my favorite series. This is, I'm sure it's going to become one of my favorite series. And John Gwynne is climbing the ladder of becoming one of my favorite authors. He's just wonderful. He's just amazing. He's exactly the type of author I want to read. He writes the type of stories I want to read. And so those are my favorite reads of the summer. Sorry it's been so long since I've made a video, but I'm going to try to get back and get more consistent in this. But I'm glad to be back, and go read books.